What if the history of invention is not only a story of what we built, but of what we almost learned to see? Across the last century, in hospital basements, private workshops, university labs, and quiet government facilities, certain machines appeared at the edge of accepted knowledge. They were often crude by modern standards: wires, lenses, coils, film plates, tape reels, improvised chambers. Yet each of them was guided by the same ancient desire: to look past the surface of things and glimpse whatever waits just beyond ordinary perception. Some inventors chased light so faint it seemed impossible. Others listened for voices inside static, measured the body at the threshold of death, or tried to map the hidden architecture of thought itself. Their work did not always begin with grand ambition. Sometimes it started with an accident: a flicker on a photographic plate, a strange recording, an instrument behaving in ways no one expected. But once the first anomaly appeared, curiosity took hold. What followed was rarely simple. Around every discovery, doubt gathered. Scientists questioned the methods. Institutions grew cautious. Notes were misplaced, devices dismantled, conclusions softened into silence. In some cases, the evidence may have been misunderstood. In others, perhaps the questions were simply too large, touching regions where physics, memory, emotion, and mortality begin to overlap. This is not a tale about proving ghosts or declaring hidden worlds as fact. It is something more human than that. It is about the recurring moment when a person stands before the unknown and refuses to look away. It is about the fragile line between measurement and meaning, between what can be recorded and what can only be felt. Because every age believes it has named reality, and every age, sooner or later, discovers how much remains in shadow. It began with a flicker no one was meant to notice. In 1913, in a Soviet laboratory more practical than glamorous, a technician named Semyon Kirlian was repairing medical equipment when he saw a brief flare of light leap around living tissue touched by a high-frequency current. It was not a blaze, not even a spark in the ordinary sense. It was a thin, trembling aura, there for an instant and gone. For most people, it would have been a curiosity. For Kirlian and his wife Valentina, it became a question that would follow them for decades. They started with simple materials: photographic plates, electrical fields, patience, leaves, fingertips, insects, small organic fragments. What emerged on film was unsettling in its beauty. Around each object appeared a halo of light, delicate and branching, like frost spreading across glass. The images seemed to change with condition and mood. Healthy tissue gave off sharp, vivid coronas. Weakened samples appeared dimmer, fractured, as though the image itself were tired. Then came the photograph that refused to behave. A torn leaf was placed onto the plate, only half of it physically present. Yet in the developed image, the outline of the missing section seemed to linger as a ghostly trace, a faint architecture of what had been there before. The effect would later be argued over, repeated imperfectly, and dismissed by many as a quirk of moisture or discharge. Still, the image endured because it touched something older than science: the suspicion that absence is not always empty. Institutes took interest. Some hoped the method might help detect illness before symptoms spoke aloud. Others saw danger in where such a line of inquiry might lead. The work drifted toward the edges of respectability, caught between medical promise and metaphysical unease. Records narrowed. Access tightened. The brightest images faded into rumor. And yet the question remained: if living things carry patterns beyond what the eye can see, what else about us is real long before it becomes visible? What if a camera could capture more than a face, more than a room, more even than a moment? In the years after Kirlian's strange images began to circulate, another set of researchers and experimenters turned toward an older human obsession. Whether thought, emotion, or presence might leave a visible imprint, their tools were different, but the longing was familiar. They pointed lenses not only at bodies, but at the spaces around them, hoping that under the right conditions, the invisible might step, briefly, into form. One of the most curious efforts gathered around a device often described as a thought camera. The idea sounded almost childish at first, like something imagined in a novel. Sit quietly, concentrate on an image, focus on a memory, a symbol, a face, then let a sealed camera or sensitized plate attempt to record what the mind was holding. Many trials produced nothing at all. Blank film, static fog, smudged abstractions that meant only what the viewer wanted them to mean. But every so often, an image appeared that resisted easy dismissal. A shape with recognizable structure. A face that had not been staged. A symbol aligned uncannily with what a subject claimed to be imagining. Skeptics pointed rightly to contamination, suggestion, wishful interpretation, the delicate unreliability of both film and memory. Yet the persistence of the experiments suggested that even failure had become meaningful. People were not merely testing machines. They were testing the boundary between inner life and the external world. This boundary has always unsettled us. We speak as though thoughts are private, sealed somewhere behind the eyes. But the body betrays feeling in pulse, heat, posture, chemistry. A room changes when grief enters it. Silence can press against the skin. Anyone who has sat beside a dying parent or watched a child dream knows instinctively that the mind is not a simple hidden object. It radiates, it shapes atmosphere. It leaves traces, though not always one's instruments can neatly define. The thought camera never became accepted science. It remained suspended between experiment and projection, between sincere inquiry and the possibility of self-deception. But perhaps that is why it still matters. It asked a question technology still has not resolved. Where does a thought end and where does the world begin? Can a machine listen to what grief is too afraid to invent on its own? By the middle of the 20th century, the search for hidden images was joined by a quieter pursuit: hidden voices. It often started in ordinary rooms: a tape recorder on a table, a microphone near an empty chair, the soft hiss of magnetic reels turning in the dark. Researchers, hobbyists, and bereaved families all leaned toward the same possibility, that somewhere inside static, something human might still be trying to speak. Among the most discussed figures was Fredrik Jurgensen, a Swedish artist and filmmaker who, in the late 1950s, believed he heard voices while recording birdsong outdoors. At first, he assumed the sounds were stray radio interference. But the more he listened, the more the fragments seemed intimate, directed, familiar. Others followed. Recordings were made in studios, homes, chapels, and improvised laboratories. Out of the wash of noise came clipped syllables, names, warnings, reassurances. Many were faint enough to invite doubt. Some were clear enough to unsettle even the people who distrusted them. The phenomenon came to be called electronic voice phenomena, or EVP, though the phrase itself never solved the mystery. Engineers pointed to radio bleed, audio pareidolia, signal contamination, the mind's powerful instinct to turn chaos into language. They were not wrong. Human beings are pattern-making creatures. We hear a message in wind, a melody in machinery, a memory in the creak of an old house. Yet for those who had lost someone, the recordings felt different. They did not merely hear sound. They heard recognition. That may be the deeper story here. Every recording device is, in some sense, a machine built to resist disappearance. We preserve laughter, testimony, music, final phone calls, a child's first words, a parent's fading voice. Technology does not end loss, but it changes how loss lives among us. The tape recorder became more than an instrument. It became a vessel for longing. No consensus ever arrived. The voices remained suspended between artifact and encounter, between accident and meaning. But the question they left behind has never fully gone silent. When we listen closely enough to noise, are we uncovering another realm, or simply discovering how desperately human beings want the dead to remain within hearing? What if the most elusive frontier was never outer space, but the instant a life leaves the body? Few ideas have gripped human imagination more persistently than the question of what happens at death. Religion gave it language. Philosophy gave it argument. Science, for the most part, approached it with caution. And yet, from time to time, someone tried to measure the threshold itself, to treat the final moment not only as a spiritual mystery, but as a physical event that might leave a trace. In the early 20th century, one of the most haunting attempts came from Dr. Duncan MacDougall, a physician in Massachusetts who became known for a grim but unforgettable experiment. He placed dying patients on a specially calibrated scale and watch for any sudden change in weight at the moment of death. His hope was startlingly direct. If the soul existed as something real, perhaps it possessed mass, however slight. The reported result, a small loss in weight, would echo for decades, repeated in headlines, arguments, and whispered retellings far beyond the narrow room where the measurements were made. The flaws were obvious. The sample was tiny. Conditions were imperfect. Bodies are complex systems, and dying is not a single clean second, but a process. Heat changes, evaporation, final breaths, shifting fluids, for more grounded explanations than metaphysics. By modern scientific standards, the experiment convinces almost no one. Yet its persistence in public memory reveals something deeper than error. MacDougall's scale was not merely a device. It was a symbol of a larger human impulse, the longing to know whether something essential in us can be counted, weighed, or proven to endure. We build instruments because mystery is hard to live with. But when the mystery concerns the people we love, the impulse becomes intimate. We do not only ask what death is, we ask whether anything of the person remains beyond it. No machine has settled that question. Still, the image remains powerful. A quiet room, a bed, a physician leaning over a dial, waiting for the invisible to announce itself. And perhaps that is why the experiment still lingers. Not because it answered anything, but because it exposed the ancient ache beneath all measurement. When the body falls silent, what, if anything, has truly gone? What if the body remembers truths the mind cannot explain? Long before brain imaging filled screens with colored maps of thought, researchers were already searching for subtler signs: electrical shifts, skin responses, pulse changes, invisible fluctuations that seemed to rise before a person could fully name what they felt. The hope was both scientific and intimate. Perhaps the human organism was sensing more than consciousness could easily translate, registering danger, memory, or meaning just ahead of language. This idea inspired a range of experiments, some rigorous, others wandering toward the edge of accepted inquiry. Subjects were shown images, asked questions, or exposed to random events while instruments tracked minute reactions in the body. A hand resting on a sensor might reveal sweat changes too slight to notice. Heart rhythms might alter before a person consciously identified fear. Tiny disturbances in attention seemed to arrive like weather fronts before thought had organized itself into certainty. To many psychologists and physiologists, the explanation was straightforward. The nervous system is fast, adaptive, and often automatic. The brain and body process cues constantly, far beneath awareness. A shadow, a tone of voice, an unexpected pattern, these can move through us before we understand why. But other observers saw in these findings a more provocative possibility: that the body may act as a receiver, responsive not only to obvious stimuli, but to hidden structures of time, intention, or presence. This is where caution and wonder meet. It is easy to overreach, to turn subtle physiological reactions into grand claims about prophecy or unseen forces. Yet it is just as mistaken to pretend the body is simple. Anyone who has walked into a room and instantly felt tension or sensed a loved one's distress before a word was spoken knows that awareness often arrives in layers. Thought is only the last voice in a much older choir. The instruments used in these experiments did not uncover a supernatural code. What they revealed, more modestly and perhaps more beautifully, was that human perception is larger than conscious narration. We are constantly reading the world in ways we do not fully grasp. And that leaves us with a humbling question. If the body can know before the mind speaks, how much of our life is guided by forms of understanding we still lack the language to see? What if the eye is only one version of sight? For generations, inventors have tried to widen the narrow band of human perception. We are told, correctly, that visible light is only a sliver of the electromagnetic world. Beyond its stretched wavelengths, the body cannot naturally decode infrared, ultraviolet, radio, X-rays. Once that fact became common knowledge, it changed the meaning of vision itself. Seeing was no longer a fixed human gift. It became a technical problem. Build the right instrument, and the unseen might step forward. That ambition gave rise to devices that could reveal heat in darkness, structures beneath skin, stars hidden by distance, and signatures of energy no naked eye could detect. In wartime and medicine, These tools proved their worth quickly. Infrared imaging showed bodies through night and fog. Ultraviolet techniques exposed markings, residues, and patterns invisible by daylight. Spectral cameras turned ordinary surfaces into layered records, storing more information than appearance alone could ever offer. But at the edges of this progress, more unusual claims gathered. Some experimenters believed certain spectral systems could register not just temperature or chemistry, but emotional disturbance, disease before symptoms, even residual traces in places marked by trauma. A room, they suggested, might hold more than air. A body might emit stories long before diagnosis. Most of these claims remained unproven, vulnerable to interpretation, technical error, and the natural temptation to see meaning where the image itself is ambiguous. Still, the deeper lesson endured. Every new imaging tool has humbled human certainty. Again and again, technology has shown that absence was often only a failure of the senses. The infection was there before the scan. The planet was there before the telescope. The fracture was there before the film. Reality did not suddenly appear. We simply acquired a better way to meet it. There is something deeply moving in that pattern. We spend our lives trusting what seems plain before us, forgetting how partial every perspective is. The unseen is not always mystical. Sometimes it is simply waiting for a language of light we have not yet learned to speak. And that raises a quiet question. How much of truth remains invisible, not because it is hidden, but because we still lack the eyes to notice it? What if memory is not stored like a file, but scattered like light across water? As the 20th century advanced, some researchers began to imagine the brain less as a mechanical switchboard and more as a field of patterns, distributed, layered, and surprisingly resilient. Memories did not seem to sit in one neat location waiting to be retrieved. They emerged through networks, through associations, through fragile acts of reconstruction. And from that insight came a daring idea. Perhaps the mind could be read or even partially reconstructed, not by finding a single hidden chamber, but by learning the language of its fragments. This gave rise to experiments that now feel strangely prophetic. Electrodes measured brain activity in search of recognizable signatures. Early mapping efforts tried to connect mental states with repeatable electrical rhythms. Could fear be traced? Could recognition be identified? Could an image held in the mind leave behind a pattern stable enough for a machine to interpret? Most of the answers were incomplete. The recordings were coarse, the tools limited, the conclusions often far more confident than the data deserved. Yet even the failed attempts revealed something extraordinary. The mind leaves evidence of itself. Not a perfect portrait, not a readable script, but disturbances, pulses, signatures in motion. Later generations would build on those first uncertain efforts with scanning systems capable of correlating thought, emotion, and imagery with increasing sophistication. Still, the essential mystery remained untouched. A pattern on a screen is not a childhood memory. A surge in a region of the brain is not grief itself. The map grows sharper, but the lived interior does not surrender easily. This tension is one of modern science's most haunting achievements. We can now observe aspects of thinking from the outside, yet the private reality of experience remains stubbornly intimate. No instrument has fully crossed that distance. The beloved face in memory, the smell of rain on one particular evening, the ache of regret attached to a song, these still belong first to the person who carries them. Perhaps that is the lesson hidden inside every machine built to see the mind. Knowledge can approach experience, but it does not replace it. And as our tools grow more powerful, the question becomes more urgent, not less. If we one day learn how to read the traces of thought, will we understand consciousness more deeply, or only discover how much of a human life can never be translated? What if some inventions are forgotten, not because they failed, but because they asked questions no era knows how to hold? History tends to flatter what became useful. We celebrate the machines that led directly to industries, medicines, and technologies we can name. But scattered across archives and abandoned notebooks or other devices, half-proven, misused, dismissed, or simply left behind because they stood in an uncomfortable place between science and longing. Their disappearance tells us something not only about truth, but about the conditions required for truth to be welcomed. Some inventions arrived too early, before the surrounding tools existed to test them properly. Others were attached to personalities so eccentric that serious inquiry became difficult. Funding dried up. Institutions shifted priorities. Wars redirected research. A lab closed. A prototype broke. A younger generation inherited only fragments and skepticism. In that way, even legitimate curiosity can vanish, not in scandal, but in administrative silence. There is also a subtler reason certain ideas fall away. A society can tolerate mystery more easily than ambiguity. We are comfortable saying something is impossible, and we are comfortable saying it is real. The difficult middle ground, where evidence is suggestive but incomplete, where the phenomenon may be genuine yet badly measured, where the interpretation is larger than the data, demands patience few systems reward. Grants want outcomes, headlines want certainty, memory itself prefers clean endings. And so many of these inventions drifted into a cultural half-life. They survived as anecdotes, late-night radio topics, fringe documentaries, family stories, and yellowing photographs passed from one hand to another. Sometimes that marginal status protected them from overstatement. Sometimes it buried worthwhile questions beside dubious claims. The result is a strange inheritance. Not a body of settled knowledge, but a landscape of interrupted attempts. There is something profoundly human in that incompleteness. Not every search reaches the shoreline. Not every instrument built with sincerity finds a language the world is ready to hear. Yet failure too leaves a record. It shows us what people feared losing, what they hoped to verify, what they were unwilling to stop asking. And perhaps that is why these forgotten machines still matter. They remind us that progress is not only a march of answers, it is also an archive of unanswered questions waiting, in their own quiet way, to be seen again. What if the strangest inventions were never really about machines at all, but about the limits of certainty? By the time these devices had passed through laboratories, workshops, seance rooms, hospitals, and speculative research circles, a pattern had become impossible to ignore. Again and again, the machine stood at the center of the story, but never as the true subject. The real subject was always the same: the human need to know whether reality is larger than the portion we can measure with confidence. Consider what these instruments were asked to do. A camera was told to photograph the residue of life. A recorder was asked to separate meaning from static. A scale was placed beneath a dying body and given the burden of proving continuation. Electrodes were arranged in hopes that thought itself might become visible from the outside. Each effort borrowed the authority of science, yet each also carried something older than science: hope, grief, dread, wonder, the refusal to believe that the surface of things is all there is. That tension matters. It explains why such inventions attract both devotion and suspicion. The more deeply a question touches mortality, memory, and consciousness, the harder it becomes to keep inquiry emotionally neutral. We do not examine these mysteries as detached observers. We bring our losses into the room. We bring our fear of oblivion. We bring our longing for signs. A machine, however precise, cannot remove that burden. It can only refract it. And yet there is no shame in that. Some of the most meaningful discoveries in history began not from certainty, but from ache. The desire to find what cannot easily be seen has given us telescopes, microscopes, radiography, deep-sea imaging, brain scans. Again and again, curiosity has expanded the map of the real. It has also, just as often, revealed how vulnerable we are to illusion. Both truths belong to the same story. So perhaps the lesson here is not that the unseen has been proven, nor that it has been debunked and set aside. Perhaps the lesson is more demanding. We are creatures drawn toward mystery, but responsible for meeting it with humility. And the finest instrument we possess may still be the one hardest to calibrate: a mind willing to wonder without surrendering its judgment. What if the unseen world we chase is, in part, a mirror held up to ourselves? The longer one lingers with these inventions, the more their technical details begin to recede, and the more the people behind them come into focus. Not just the celebrated inventors, but the widows sitting beside recorders late at night, the patients submitting to strange measurements in the hope that suffering might finally make sense. The researchers who risked embarrassment because one anomaly, one flicker, one impossible result had unsettled their certainty. Beneath every device was a human story, and beneath every human story was longing. That is why the history of these machines resists easy mockery. Even when the methods were weak, even when conclusions outran evidence, the impulse itself was rarely foolish. It was familiar. We all want to know that pain is not random, that memory is not merely chemical residue, that love leaves some durable imprint on the world. We want to believe the invisible is not empty. The machine became a way to ask these ancient questions in modern language. At times, that language misled people. Instruments can create a dangerous illusion of authority. A dial moves, a waveform spikes, an image appears on film, and suddenly emotion acquires the costume of proof. This is where some inquiries wandered into self-deception. The desire for meaning can become so intense that it fills silence with voices and shadow with structure. Not because people are dishonest, but because hope is one of the strongest lenses we have. Still, it would be too simple to end there. For every mistaken interpretation, there is also a reminder that science itself grows by taking anomalies seriously, even when most turn out to be errors. Progress depends on curiosity disciplined by doubt. The problem is not asking too much of reality. The problem is deciding too quickly what reality must be. So these forgotten inventions leave behind more than unresolved claims. They reveal a portrait of human beings standing between skepticism and wonder, trying to honor both. And maybe that is the deeper mystery, not whether the unseen exists, but why across every generation we continue building new ways to search for it, as if some part of us remembers that the world has always been larger than our explanations. What if the greatest danger is not that we believe too much, but that we stop asking what remains beyond the frame? Modern life encourages a certain confidence in what can be quantified. We trust the scan, the graph, the algorithm, the digital archive. These tools have earned that trust in countless ways. They diagnose disease, predict storms, preserve voices, recover lost texts, reveal galaxies, and help us see patterns that no unaided mind could hold. Yet every powerful instrument also shapes the world by what it overlooks. To measure is to choose. To observe is to frame. And outside every frame, something remains. The older inventions we have followed through this story now seem both naive and prophetic. Naive because many of them lack the controls, precision, and discipline needed to support their boldest claims. Prophetic because they sensed a truth that modern science continues to rediscover. Reality is layered, and perception is always partial. The visible is not the whole. The audible is not the whole. The conscious mind is not the whole of human knowing. This does not mean every strange report conceals a hidden world. It means humility is wiser than dismissal. History has repeatedly shown how easily certainty collapses when new methods arrive. The air once seemed empty until radio filled it with voices. The night sky seemed sparse until stronger telescopes revealed its depth. The body seemed opaque until imaging taught us to see through skin and bone. Each advance did more than add information. It changed the scale of our ignorance. That may be the true inheritance of these forgotten devices, not proof of spirits or secret energies or lost dimensions waiting conveniently for belief. Their gift is subtler. They remind us that curiosity has moral weight. To remain curious is to resist the arrogance of the finished worldview. It is to admit that mystery is not the enemy of a knowledge, but often its beginning. And so the question widens. In an age crowded with information, can we still preserve the older discipline of wonder? The kind that seeks evidence, honors doubt, and yet refuses to imagine that the known world is all there is? What if, after all the failed devices and unfinished experiments, the real discovery is the shape of our own unfinishedness? By now, the machines in this story have become almost secondary. Their plates, coils, sensors, reels, and chambers remain fascinating, but they no longer stand alone. They form a kind of emotional archaeology, revealing layer after layer of what human beings have hoped to preserve against time. Not just proof, not just knowledge, but continuity. A sign that the self is more than a biological event, that memory is more than decay, that absence may still contain relation. This is why the unseen continues to call to us, even in an age of extraordinary technical power. We have mapped genes, photographed black holes, and built systems that can detect signals from the edge of the observable universe. Yet the questions nearest to the heart remain strangely resistant. What is consciousness fully considered? Why does memory feel so alive, even when the moment it carries is long gone? Why does grief make a room feel inhabited by more than the living people inside it? Progress has sharpened the tools, but it has not dissolved the ache. Perhaps that is not a failure. Perhaps it is a condition of being human. Some mysteries do not exist merely to be solved. They exist to orient us, to keep us honest about scale, to remind us that explanation and meaning are not always identical. A machine may tell us how signals travel through the brain. It may tell us how light behaves at the edge of tissue, how sound degrades on magnetic tape, how the body shifts in its final minutes. These are real achievements, but they do not exhaust the lived reality of love, fear, wonder, or loss. And so these inventions, whether valid, flawed, or forever undecided, leave behind a final kind of knowledge. They show that human beings are not satisfied with surfaces. We listen at doors no one can open. We hold damaged photographs to the light. We replay static, hoping to hear a name. We build instruments not only to conquer nature, but to negotiate our loneliness within it. Maybe that is the quiet truth waiting beneath every experiment. The search for the unseen is also a search for a more spacious understanding of ourselves. So where does this leave us after the strange photographs, the whispered recordings, the measured last breaths, and the fragile attempts to map what hides beneath the visible world? It leaves us, perhaps, where all meaningful inquiry eventually arrives, not at certainty, but at a deeper form of attention. These inventions, scattered across decades and disciplines, never assembled into one final answer. They did something more valuable and more difficult. They exposed the edges of our confidence. They reminded us that the world is not obligated to fit the limits of our current instruments, and that human experience will always outrun any one explanation we build to contain it. Some of these machines were flawed. Some likely recorded artifacts, coincidences, or the projections of longing onto unstable data. Some may have brushed against real phenomena without possessing the language or precision to describe them properly. To admit this uncertainty is not weakness, it is honesty. And honesty in the presence of mystery is its own kind of courage. What endures is not the promise that hidden realms have been proven. It is the image of generations refusing indifference. Men and women stood before static, light, silence, and death, and chose to ask one more question. They chose to believe that even where evidence was incomplete, curiosity remained honorable. That instinct has shaped every age of discovery. It carries us from candle-lit rooms to observatories, from basement experiments to orbiting telescopes, from failed prototypes to new ways of seeing. In the end, the unseen may not be a single place waiting behind a veil. It may be a name for all that exceeds us: memory, consciousness, loss, time, love, and the vast unfinished architecture of reality itself. We do not honor those mysteries by surrendering judgment, nor by mocking wonder out of existence. We honor them by keeping both alive, skepticism in one hand, humility in the other. And maybe that is the most human vision of all, to stand in the half-light of what we know, aware of how much remains beyond us, and still choose to look with care.